we've unlocked a new level of partisan bickering, mistrust among both parties that we haven't seen in previous shutdown battles because at this point it just seems like the gloves are off. There's no rules. They're just blaming each other and using every means possible to try and shape the messaging around it.
Hey, Courtney. Hey, Katrina. How are you guys?
Hey guys.
Hey, hey, good to see you both again. I do look forward to these little chats and we talk about what's up and down in Washington all week. And this
Or
week it's a
gone.
case of what's down and never to come back.
Yeah, yeah. The East Wing of the White House, is no longer there.
Yes, what began as, the president saying he wasn't going to touch the White House, he was just going to add on to it, has turned into just completely demolishing a portion of the White House, as you said, the East Wing, to make room for his $250 million ballroom that he's been talking about for months.
Those pictures will have to go down, I think, as some of the most poignant pictures of this year, if not of this Trump administration, because the visuals of the White House are just so familiar, aren't they? And when you see a couple of excavators in there ripping the sides off it, just like any construction site or any demolition site, there's something kind of, from what we've been hearing from people, very emotional about it, isn't there? I suppose if we explain the East Wing, first of all, it's not really the main business part of the White House, although it is very important. It's the First Lady's part of the White House, isn't it? I mean, Courtney, you spend a lot of time down there.
It's also the most public portion of the White House, right? That's the part of the White House that the public is allowed to come into. It's also where they typically host their holiday parties. It's where, when they have the garden tour, people, this is the part where, the public is allowed to experience the White House, see some of the history. And so there is a lot of emotional attachment, I think, tangled up into that specific part of the building.
Many Americans will have selfies, actually, won't they, at that portico entrance, because if you are lucky enough to get a ticket to one of the parties or one of those public events, and I know anytime I've gone through there, that's always the first place that people sort of stop and say, oh, take my picture, I'm here at the White House, and the flags are behind them, and there's always a great excitement to be going into that building.
I was just actually looking back at some of the pictures from last Christmas's media party at the White House and just how spectacular the decorations are in there. And it is something that, people really look forward to, especially around the time of the holidays. And it's, the fact that you can see now from the Treasury building straight through to the White House it's just something that completely changes the landscape. And of course, President Trump had said initially that it has nothing to do with the White House itself. It is, of course, attached. It's a part of the White House. And as you both said, the First Lady's offices have been in there. But beyond that kind of emotional attachment to it, there are questions, of course, being asked about how this is being funded. And President Trump, the White House, they've been very quick to say that President Trump himself and some of his friends, as he has put it, are putting up the money for this construction. And at the same time, I think there is this understanding, if you will, that while the government is shut down, while prices are still high for consumers, that, and federal workers, of course, are being furloughed, that, the imagery here perhaps is not the best for the White House.
I mean, I think there's a couple of points there that we should flesh out a little bit, right? First of all, the who is paying for it. A White House official told USA Today, there are the private donors that President Trump mentioned and the president himself, but the White House official said Lockheed Martin, Palantir, Alphabet's Google, Meta and Amazon are among the companies who have made donations to this big build. So, the ethics officials have been saying, well, what are those companies getting in exchange for those donations? Is this purely for the good of America? And equally, the private donors, who are the private donors? There are a lot of answers, I suppose, that are still forthcoming on those points, aren't there? And also, we should point out that, and there's been much commentary about this week, that the president can do this. He hasn't done anything illegal. Maybe there's a question of taste or a question of due process for people. But according to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the White House is exempt from the required reviews that other federal agencies have to undergo before they do developments to their buildings like this. And we've heard from the White House as well, haven't we? They've been quick to point out about all the other developments that other presidents have made over the years.
Yeah, I mean, a few examples. Obviously, the former President Barack Obama added a basketball court. The briefing room, where reporters, myself included, have spent a lot of hours, at one point was a swimming pool and was paved over to accommodate all of the reporters. So you're right. This isn't something that's new, but certainly previous administrations have done the courtesy of submitting their plans before they begin to break ground. This obviously isn't the case with Trump. And I think it sort of strikes at the heart of who he is. He is a real estate developer, of course, before he entered politics. He is somebody who has come up against regulations and permitting processes throughout his career. He's been fighting against it. And now he's at the helm, of one of the most iconic buildings in the country. And the hurdles that typically would be there for him in his previous career are not, because he's cleared them, and and appointed, made these political appointees, including his own staff secretary who is overseeing this. So I think that's an important thing to remember, that he probably takes great satisfaction in, seeing some of these updates and remodeling the White House, because it is of course who he is.
I think it's interesting, the Republican strategists I've spoken to about this, will American voters pay attention to this? Will they be unhappy with this? They've said, look, the president is well within his right, as you both pointed out, to make, to remodel. Of course, this is a bit bigger than the traditional remodeling that you guys have referred to from previous presidents. But that being said, they've also said, the White House did need an update and needed a much bigger entertaining space, if you will, for kind of the state visits that you see and banquets and dinners. And they've made the point, in 20 years from now, presidents will be using this ballroom and grateful to have it. Whether that's the case, of course, we don't actually know yet. But that's some of the defense that we've seen from President Trump's supporters. And on the other hand, of course, you have Democrats saying, look at the fact that federal workers are not receiving paychecks, the fact that, the price of beef is higher than it's ever been, up 51% since the year 2020, up 51%. And the fact that you have this massive ballroom construction, even if it is being paid for by President Trump and by some of these wealthy donors.
Coming back to the question on the donors and who's paying for it, it raises questions about the regulations that are in place of not prohibiting the use of public office for private gain, which is something, there have been questions surrounding him and his use of public office since the first administration. But the question of what donors get out of this, and this sort of pay to play access that they might get if they are putting up money for this ballroom, is concerning to a lot of ethics experts that we have spoken to, who say, you know, what does like $25 million get you if you're gonna fund one of his projects and it lands you a meeting, or it lands you a seat at an event next to maybe somebody who's in charge of regulations that you are seeking to get access for, so there's a lot of questions around what role companies will play beyond just footing the bill here, and the fact that it's not going to be taxpayer funded.
We have had one poll on this from YouGov during the week, didn't we, that said that 53% of the American people who'd been surveyed opposed the demolition of the East Wing, 23% supported it, and the remainder, well, they were unsure as to kind of what their views on that was. And as we've been discussing, there's a lot of information lacking about who's paying for it, what they're getting for it, even what this will look like, because the footprint of this ballroom is going to be a total space that's twice the size of the existing footprint of the White House. So the visuals of it could be quite dramatically changed as well. What has struck me, though, this week talking to Democratic and Republican strategists is sometimes you might have been expecting outrage on this, and there's been an element of shoulder shrugging. Oh, the president can do this. It's just a building kind of thing. Yes, it's sad about the history, but we'll wait and see. And we have bigger battles to fight, which just kind of makes the point about this whole pace of this administration and everything that's going on and things that are being pulled down, whether they're physical structures or not. It's that the Democrats are kind of struggling to keep up with what's going on and what their responses to some of this stuff should be as well.
Yeah, the symbolism of that is really interesting, isn't it? And, you can't forget the fact that Democrats and Republicans here in Washington were 20 plus days into a government shutdown, and they are concerned that most of the focus will be on that and less on these images we're seeing from the White House. But again, as you both pointed out, I think, these visuals clearly are something that have people, raising their eyebrows here in DC and perhaps beyond as well. Anybody who's come to visit Washington and walk by the White House and wanted to have a picture in front of that fence. But I mean, I've also been thinking about the fact that we have talked in the past about certain, let's say, policy measures from the Trump administration, perhaps distracting from things that they're keen to distract from. And I wonder if that's the case as well with the shutdown. I mean, Republicans and Democrats, I don't know how you both feel. I heard that some Uber drivers are now kind of taking bets on how long this shutdown will go. And they're talking about going till Christmas or New Year's. And let's hope that's not the case and that both sides can come together before that. But my sense is that both sides are not only digging in, but essentially saying there's nothing to negotiate, even if there are side conversations happening. And we've all asked lawmakers this. That doesn't seem to be the case.
One of the proposals that, is floating around has been passing a temporary spending bill to fund the government through December 2026, which is conveniently after the midterm elections. And I don't think there's real seriousness with that proposal, but it does seem that both parties are really looking to the White House. I think they're waiting for Donald Trump to refocus his attention on getting the government back open before they can have real conversations about how they go about doing that.
I mean, that is traditionally the way, isn't it, with shutdowns, is that, the lawmakers on the Hill have conversations to a point, but ultimately it's the president of the party in power who kind of gets in there and knocks the heads together and makes a bit of progress. And what's been striking for me is you have a president here who's not afraid of a shutdown. He holds the record for the longest shutdown, if you want to call it that, in his first administration, 35 days. He doesn't seem to have any qualms about barreling towards that same point and beyond it at this point in time. We talked about it before on the pod, never wasting a good crisis, that kind of business adage. And that looks like what this administration is doing with this shutdown. The other interesting point is the bill that they keep voting on only would fund the government through November 18th. So there does come a point at which it's pointless keeping voting on that because, if they pass the day of November 18th, then they have to go back to square one and talk about a new bill anyway because it's totally out of date and it'll have to go through the House. And I think you're potentially there adding weeks and weeks more onto this shutdown. And I feel, the Democrats have tied this so much into healthcare premiums that are they waiting on the November 1st deadline when people have to start renewing their policies and they can see for themselves then when those healthcare markets open up just how much more expensive their policies are going to be, and they're sort of relying on voters to put the pressure on the Republican Party once they have that black and white evidence for themselves, whereas Republicans, I think, are more waiting to get to Thanksgiving maybe and see traffic chaos and people not being able to get through airports and not being able to get home and that being a pinch point for them. I don't know what you guys think.
It's hard to say at this point, what both sides are waiting for. You have heard some quiet rumblings, some even public from Republicans who have said, look, the question of healthcare subsidies is an issue. We do recognize the fact that this could be something that could hurt voters across the country, Americans across the country, who might see their healthcare premiums go up significantly. But their continuing point, and again, to the point that you both made, it all funnels down from President Trump. Their point is that these are two separate conversations, that if you want to have a talk about healthcare subsidies, a vote could possibly be scheduled for after the government reopens, but first the government must reopen. And the Democrats see this is the only wedge they can get in the door at the moment, and they want to hold on to that for now. And, I asked a few Democrat lawmakers, if these health care subsidies are so important to you and to, people across the country, why not then agree to open the government first and set a date now already for when those subsidies can be voted on? And they've said, frankly, we don't trust Republicans that vote will go ahead. We don't trust that they will vote to extend those subsidies, or that they won't be used somehow to, manipulate the message and narrative against Democrats. And the complete lack of trust there, we all know that we're living in a very polarized Washington, D.C., but that's something that is so striking because in previous shutdowns, and you both know this having covered previous shutdowns, there were always some conversations happening and some kind of across the aisle dealing and talking. And even if the president's the one who knocks the heads together, you got the sense that those conversations were at least still somewhat productive. I don't get that sense now.
Yeah, I mean, I do think in some ways they're both looking at the polling, right? Trying to figure out who's actually getting blamed for this by American voters. But we are going to start seeing some of the real world consequences of this beyond the 750,000 furloughed workers and thousands more who are going without pay. We're now seeing states fearing the fact that they're not going to have money to fund their supplemental nutrition program, benefits program, which is called SNAP. And in some of these Democrat-led states, they're taking a page from the Trump administration playbook, and they're putting on their websites saying this is because of the Republicans who are keeping the government shut down, which is something that the Trump administration did at U.S. airports. Kristi Noem, the Homeland Secretary, was, airing an advertisement blaming Democrats. They put some of that messaging on some of the federal websites. So we've unlocked a new level of partisan bickering and mistrust among both parties that we haven't seen in previous shutdown battles, because at this point it just seems like the gloves are off. There's no rules. They're just blaming each other and using every means possible to try and shape the messaging around it.
And, in that instance, everyone's a loser with the voters, in my experience. Having traveled around this country now for many elections, talking to voters, they all kind of say, oh, Washington, D.C., up there, those people, they've nothing to do with me. And a lot of that stems from this exact point, they're all infighting there, whereas I can't put money on I can't put gas in my car, I can't put food on my table. If these food stamps programs that you're talking about, Courtney, I mean, if they dry up, that's a really serious problem in a country like this, where there isn't a sort of welfare program equivalent to what we're used to seeing in Europe. There isn't that kind of adequate safety net for people who fall on hard times. That's going to have a really harsh impact on a lot of people. And, again, just to have a quick look at the polling on this, the Quinnipiac University had a poll out this week saying that, let me just get the figures here, 45% of registered voters think Republicans are to blame for this shutdown. 39% think Democrats are. So, when you factor in a margin of error there, that's basically people think they're both, there's a pair of them in it. Really, they're both to blame here, which also doesn't give an impetus to either side to really push forward for progress and change their position on this.
It doesn't. And instead, what we've seen is that messaging battle, this narrative battle over and over across all airwaves and all shows. And in fact, we saw the Democratic senator from Oregon, Jeff Merkley, launch another one of those marathon speeches on the floor of the Senate. And there's not really any Senate business happening that he's disrupting, except another vote that, of course, as expected, failed on reopening the government. But the point of that is a 20-plus hour speech on the floor, like when Senator Cory Booker did it earlier in the year, is all about clipping out, elements of that speech, putting it on social media, hoping that some of these elements go viral and reach through to some of those voters. in that vacuum of government action, Democrats are hoping that they perhaps can wrest back some of the narrative. That remains to be seen because, of course, when the president is in the White House, the president's a Republican, of course, both houses, so the House of Representatives, Senate is Republican. It's very hard for Democrats to be able to take back the messaging on this.
And I think, going back to your point about this being a president who is not afraid of a shutdown, we've seen he's been a bit exacting about who he is making this more painful for and who he is trying to ease the pain for. The Trump administration is shifting around billions of dollars to try and fund the agencies they want to remain open. He's trying to make this as painful as possible for Democrats or agencies he perceives as democratic agencies, as he's called them. And that just extends the pain for everyone, right? It's not, there's just no end in sight if they're just finding ways to remove some of those pressure points that typically have led to a breakdown and eventually in negotiations to funding the government. So I don't really see a clear way out of this without the president being refocused and trying to figure out a way to work with his party and potentially the Democrats to end the stalemate.
And it is a stalemate. I mean, no more than both of you have, I'm sure. I've asked many elected representatives, what's the way out of here? And even they of either party don't really have a clear answer to that. And a lot of it is about the messaging and the optics. And then you look at somewhere like California and the governor there, Gavin Newsom, calling in the National Guard to help with food banks because he thinks the knock-on impact of this shutdown is going to be that people are so hungry and can't afford anything because they're not being paid. Federal workers, ordinarily in what are considered to be very good jobs, even if not necessarily high paid, but they are generally permanent and secure, that they're going to be going to food banks to the extent that he'll need the National Guard there to help hand out food parcels. I mean, if it gets to that point, that they'll be quite damning images as well.
Just think about the symbolism of that with the entire debate that we've had on this pod before as well about National Guard deployments to Democrat-led cities. And you have them here in Washington, D.C., and although the mayor has welcomed the National Guard deployment in the fact that it's brought down violent crime in Washington, they've also been involved in picking up trash and beautifying the city. And then you see the National Guard handing out food parcels in California because of a shutdown. It just raises the stakes that much higher. And of course, we know there's no love lost between California's Governor Gavin Newsom and President Trump and how much that battle has played out on the very public stage. But I wonder at some point, we are already, and I know nobody likes to hear this, barreling towards the midterms next year. I know everyone, every time I mention that, says, please slow down, but it is the truth.
There's still a year, more than
it's the truth. And that messaging is so important. And what I try to keep in mind is that at some point the shutdown will be over, whether it's in 2 weeks or 4 weeks or perhaps even longer, who knows. But there's still a long time between the shutdown and the next midterms. And even though it's barreling towards us, there's so much messaging that happens in between. And I wonder if all of this political capital and messaging and narrative battles happening are not for naught, really, in the end, because there are people suffering real world consequences. Both sides, as you mentioned in that polling, Katrina, are not coming out very well on this. And in the end, it just looks like Washington can't get their things together and be able to actually negotiate on anything at all, and sets both parties back.
I suspect we'll be talking about this again next week, though, looking at the pace of progress so far.
Probably.
Groundhog Day.
Yeah. Well, we are at it for today anyway. So yeah, we'll talk about shutdown and whatever else happens in the next week. I look forward to that, whatever's up and down here in Washington, D.C.
See you guys then.
Great to be with you.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you, so please do leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.